Hi there, you guys. This is a video to go over this PowerPoint that reintroduces some of the important concepts about integrating sources into your own writing. Let me see, let me make this bigger. Hang on just a second. I want to start from right here. Okay, so we've been writing with sources all semester. And as I said previously about MLA format, excuse me, I haven't really been marking down your essays for, inconsistent integration and documentation of the source material that you've been giving in support of your own points, because that really hasn't been the main point of those assignments. But for this one, it is. It's one of the main points of this assignment is to demonstrate the understanding of the concepts that relate to using sources in your own writing, introducing them in a way that's clear for your audience, so that your audience knows who's talking. They can clearly distinguish between your ideas and the ideas of the sources that you're borrowing from to support your own ideas, and the correct use of summary, paraphrase, and direct quote in presenting evidence from text and outside sources to support your ideas. They have to be smoothly integrated. Okay, let me scoot down here. So this is a research paper where you're using lots and lots of outside sources, more than you have in the past. In the past, you've just used a couple, 3 or 4 at the most sources. In Essay 2, you weren't required to use any sources other than the image that you found. But with this project, you're using lots of sources, so it's more important to present those correctly and clearly for your audience. All right, and here's some reasons why. It establishes your ethos as a good, reliable scholar researcher. If it's clear to your audience where the information in support of the points you're making is coming from, that demonstrates your research. And that's one of the things you want to do with this assignment, is demonstrate good quality research and the ability to choose source material well to support the points that you want it to help you support. All right, and boosting your ethos with the credibility or reputation of the sources that you choose to borrow. That shows that, their credibility transfers to you. If you've used a peer-reviewed journal article, for example, to support a point that you're making, that's a kind of source that has a high degree of ethos, a high degree of credibility, because as I explained previously, it was written by an expert and peer-reviewed by a bunch of other experts before it was even published. All right, integrating sources, as I said before, is important because it needs to be clear for your reader who's talking. And the different strategies for introducing a source and then documenting the source of the information that you're borrowing helps to keep that clear for your reader. All right, and it maintains your voice as a dominant voice in your argument. I don't know if I said this to you guys, but I said to a class last week that I've read research papers where there's a big block quote on every page. And if that's the presentation of source material, then that particular student writer's voice is getting drowned out by the voices of the sources that he or she is borrowing. Those voices, the voices of the sources, become the dominant voice, okay, in that particular piece of writing, not the voice of the student writer. And that's not what you want for this assignment. Okay, you guys are English too, so you know the difference between these things. Summary and paraphrase are both ways of representing ideas from sources entirely in your own words. The difference between a summary and a paraphrase is that a paraphrase is longer, and a summary is going to be shorter, because in summary you're condensing, okay, a lot of stuff into just the essence of a point that a source is making. You're boiling it down to its main points only. Whereas in paraphrase, you're including a lot of the details. You're just putting them all into your own words and your own sentence structure. All right, a good paraphrase is not one where a few words have been swapped out for synonyms. That, in fact, is plagiarism. Okay, and so be careful of that. I'm not going to talk a lot about paraphrasing strategies in this presentation, but if you have any doubts about how to do paraphrase, you can just Google it, and there's lots and lots and lots of instruction online that you can find on how to develop a good paraphrase. But again, you've got to put the words of the source entirely into your own words and your own syntax. And syntax is a word that means the order of the words in the sentence or in a paragraph. All right, and then everybody knows what a direct quote is. It's the exact words of the source. And those must be enclosed in quotation marks. So back to my point about paraphrasing, if you have just swapped out a few words in the original that you're borrowing and replaced those with synonyms, then you've preserved a lot of the original in that quote, paraphrase, unquote. And if you don't include those phrases or even entire sentences in quotation marks, that's plagiarism, and that'll get you an F on this assignment. So avoid that at all costs. All right, and in general, you want to summarize and paraphrase more than using direct quotes. You want to use those sparingly and only when it's important to quote the exact words of the source. And one reason for that is that if you can put the ideas of a source into your own words, that shows that you've truly understood that idea. And even if you don't, even if you quote directly, then you still need to explain what the quote means and then explicitly connect it to the main point that it's there to support. Okay, so when you're quoting a source or when you're paraphrasing or summarizing it, you need to explain what it means and explain how it connects to the idea that you're using it to support. You need to do that in words on the page for your reader and not just let them infer it. You need to explain it for them. Here's some good reasons to use direct quotes instead of paraphrase or summary. If the original language is as important as the ideas it contains, okay, if the author's words are so striking, articulate, or expressive that they contribute to the strength of the point, and I'll give you some examples in a minute of situations like that. Or if the original language is concise, in other words, if it's short and to the point, and paraphrasing won't help, and putting it into your own words won't help to clarify it. Oftentimes that won't be the case though. Oftentimes, especially if you're borrowing from a peer-reviewed journal article, for example, where there's a lot of technical or jargony or discipline-specific language in that text that you can simplify for your audience. You want to do that. You want to put those words into you want to put those quotes into your own words for your audience so that they're clearer for your audience, more easily understood. All right, but sometimes, the language will be concise. Sometimes it will be clear and to the point, and then you don't need to do that. That's a good time to use a direct quote. If the original language is from an established authority, okay, you might want to use their exact words, all right? And introduce them, right? According to Dr. So-and-so from, this famous think tank working on this problem that you're writing about, right? And then your direct quote. But that according to, that's the introductory phrase, which we'll talk more about in a minute. That helps to frame the direct quote in the way that you present it. You need to enclose it in, introduce it with a signal or introductory phrase, and then document it with in-text citations, or what I like to call parenthetical references. Alrighty. Whenever you do quote a text directly, as I said before, you cannot just let the quotes speak for themselves. You've got to explain what the quote means and how it ties to your idea, okay, with words on the page. And then you only want to extract those parts of a passage that need to be quoted, all right? And you can use ellipses, and I'll talk about those in a minute, to leave some parts of a passage out in the middle if you don't need the whole thing. Like I said, there shouldn't be a big block quote on every page. Block quotes in this particular assignment, because it's not that long, it should be pretty rare and should be really necessary. Alrighty. Okay, so here's an example of a combination. This is a really good strategy. A combination of some direct quote with some paraphrase. All right, the original from Tanya Modilewski is, if television is considered by some to be a vast wasteland, soap operas are thought to be the least nourishing spot in the desert. That's the whole quote. And in the revision, part of that has been paraphrased. And just the striking language has been kept in direct quotes from Modilewski. All right, and you know, the revision does a much better job of maintaining the writer's voice as dominant, as opposed to the source's voice that this writer is borrowing as dominant in this sentence. All right, here's another example where just a particularly striking phrase has been borrowed, and everything else in this sentence, everything else in white, is a paraphrase of William Neal's point. Neal is still credited here with this point in this introductory phrase, as William Neal suggests. That's the introductory phrase. And then everything else in this sentence is Neal's idea, but it's been presented mostly in this writer's own words, and only the phrase moral deafness is quoted from Neal, because it's particularly striking as a concept. We don't usually think of morality as having or not having hearing. All right, definitely do not use quotes as padding. It's going to be very obvious if that's what you're doing. And it's not going to help your grade. In fact, it will detract from your grade if you're just using big block quotes to extend the length of your paper. All right, use signal phrases to integrate quotes smoothly into your text, and here's some strategies. You may want to give the name of the author, and you should. The very first time you introduce a source, it's a good rule of thumb, the very first time you use this source to support your point, that you introduce that source fully. Okay, if the source has a named author, then you give the author's full name. And then after that, you can refer to that author by his or her last name only. But the very first time they show up in your text, you should introduce them fully. And maybe give their credentials if those matter, right? If, like I said, there's some, you know, authority on the subject, then you will want to let your reader know that, because that enhances the strength of the point that they're making, and then their ethos transfers to you. All right, use present tense verbs always. Okay, when you're writing academically, you're writing in the present tense. All right, so use present tense verbs. As so-and-so suggests, as so-and-so explains, according to so-and-so, as so-and-so points out. Okay, those are present tense. Indicate how you're using the source, as I just demonstrated. Are you using that source to help you argue something? Then use the word argue in your introductory phrase, as so-and-so argues. Are you using it to help you explain something, to point something out, etc.? All right, and when you use introductory or signal phrases, the two different ways of referring to the same thing. I like the phrase introductory phrase because that's what it's doing. It's introducing the source. And it's also differentiating between the ideas that you're borrowing from the source and your own ideas. It makes that clear for the reader, right? It's a little signal to your reader, hey reader, here comes an idea from a source. And then you tell the reader what the name of that source is. And it also provides transitions, little bridges between your ideas and the ideas of the sources that you're using to support them. It connects them when you use these signal or introductory phrases. Here's some specific examples. All right, Gary Miles indicates that. Right, that's a present tense verb. Right, and you can see these phrases are in different places, or can be, in the sentence. All right. One thing, though, that's another good rule of thumb is your sentences should not start with a quotation mark. All right, notice the last one on this list here. Racial profiling makes a mockery of the rights to which people in this country are entitled, claims columnist Colbert I. King. So this phrase, this introductory or signal phrase, is at the end of this sentence, but the sentence still doesn't start with a quotation. It starts with a paraphrase. Okay, this is what King is talking about. He's talking about racial profiling, right? But the direct quote starts here, not at the beginning of the sentence. Okay, and here's why you should avoid what is called the dreaded dropped quote. And I hope you guys like my scary font. I spent a lot of time choosing it because that's how I feel when I encounter a dropped quote in student writing, it's very confusing. All right, it causes me a lot of stress because I'm trying to figure out what's happening. It interrupts the flow of your writing, all right, also. And the signal and introductory phrase give context to the reader. It helps them understand why that quote is appearing there in your writing. So if you're not introducing it, then that's going to add to the confusion, and you're not doing your job as a student who's borrowing ideas from a source to support your own points, of providing your readers with the context they need to understand why that direct quote is there. All right, here's an example, or two examples, one of a dropped quote in red at the top, and then one of that same quote that is better integrated using a signal or introductory phrase. All right, in the first example, I don't know. There's a parenthetical reference there, so I know that this piece in red in quotation marks is from somebody named Shepard, but I don't know why. There's no bridge, there's no transition, and there's no differentiation between the stuff in white and the stuff in red there. Okay, and it's an abrupt shift from the writer's point to a direct quote that the writer is borrowing to support that point. But when you add the introductory phrase, that adds context, right? I know Jay Shepard is an ornithologist, and that's why I should care about what he has to say about the bald eagle, because he's a bird expert, okay? And it lets me know, hey, here's a bird expert whose point about the bald eagle is going to support my point. Here it comes, reader, here it comes. So it's less confusing, and it's much smoother, a transition between this writer's ideas and the ideas of the source they're borrowing. And notice that in the top example here, whoops, I didn't want to do that. The top example, Shepard is in the parenthetical reference here, right? I did it again, okay? I'm trying to use my cursor and highlight things, but I guess that won't work when I'm in this mode. But here, Shepard isn't in the parenthetical reference anymore, because Shepard was mentioned up here, all right? And this relates to MLA documentation, which we'll talk about in a minute, all right? But this is an example of the difference between a dropped quote and a quote that's integrated. In addition, under this direct quote, one would hope that the writer of this passage explains, right, how this direct quote, okay, is going to support the main point of this paragraph. All right, choose the introductory verbs, all of which are in the present tense, to strike the tone that you want to strike and convey your purpose for using the quote. And there's tons and tons and tons of them. This is just a small sampling. All right, and you need to use these things, these signal phrases or introductory phrases, when the author isn't named as well, or when the author is not known as well. Okay, and these are two examples of that. All right, and you also need to use them, as I said before, even if you're paraphrasing or summarizing. Even if it's not a direct quote that you're introducing, you still need to let the reader know where these ideas are coming from, whether you're quoting directly or not. And here's a couple examples. In this first example, only 2 words are quoted directly from this source, the Guns for Life website. The rest of this is paraphrase. Okay, but a signal phrase, introductory phrase is still needed. And here as well, as Blaine et al. Explain. And et al. is a Latin phrase that means and all those other people, which is something you use when you have a source where there are multiple authors. You know, more than 3, I think, is the rule in MLA. If you have more than 3, right, then you use this et al. Instead of naming them all. And with this introductory phrase, with Blaine here being referred to by his or her last name only, I assume that Blaine has been fully introduced previously, so that now this writer can refer to Blaine by his or her last name only. All right, and again, notice that there's no need to put the author's name in the parenthetical reference because it's already appeared here. Okay, whereas the title of the article that this comes from is given in the parenthetical reference, because it was not previously given in the sentence. All right, but back to introductory phrases or signal phrases, as sometimes they're referred to. If the author's credibility is important to supporting the point that you want to make, if you're making a point about the law and you have a legal scholar to help you support that point, then you need to let your reader know that. All right, legal scholar Max Moynihan contends. That's an introductory phrase that lets your audience know that they're about to read a quote from a guy who knows what he's talking about. All right, if you're making a point about human cultures, okay, let people know that Flora Davis is an anthropologist. Okay, and Dr. Redford Williams, director of the Behavioral Medicine Research Center at Duke University, fancy university. And this guy is a doctor, okay? You need to let your reader know that. And he's the director of a whole department at a fancy university. He's not just a professor there, all right? So whatever Dr. Redford has to say about whatever the subject is that's being discussed or analyzed or argued in this paper, okay, the reader is going to take that a lot more seriously because of all this guy's credentials. And this writer has let his or her reader know that. All right, I don't know if you guys have encountered the sandwich model before, but it's a very popular way that teachers have of illustrating this concept of integrating source material into your writing. The top piece of the bread is the introduction of the source, the introductory phrase or signal phrase that I've been talking about mostly so far in this presentation. And then the meat, that's the source information, whether it's paraphrase, summary, or direct quote. And then documentation, okay? You have to give the reader the information they need, if they want to go track down that source on their own. All right, and that's a parenthetical reference or in-text citation. Again, two different ways of referring to the same thing. And then the bottom piece of the bread, this is where you explain the source, okay? If necessary, if it's not obvious what the quote means, then explain what the quote means. Just think to yourself, this means that. You can even write that if you want to in your paper after a direct quote. This means that, and then explain what the quote means. And then you have to explicitly connect it to your main point. Okay, and you can think to yourself, this connects to my main point in the following way. Okay, so three things: introduce the source, present the source material and document it, and then contextualize it. What does the source mean and how does it connect to your main point? Okay, so that's three, maybe four things that you need to do when you're using source material to support your points in your writing. And here's an example of a paragraph that does those things. Okay, the main point of this paragraph is the first sentence, that's the topic sentence. And then everything else in this paragraph is going to be about that topic sentence. Many of us take our relationships for granted or fail to realize how fragile they are. And there's the introductory signal phrase. In his book, The Compadre, Dr. Torres emphasizes, right? And I use the word emphasizes as the verb on purpose, okay? Because I'm using Torres to help me emphasize something, okay? And then the rest in yellow is paraphrase of what Torres is emphasizing, okay? He emphasizes the complexities of relationships. That's my summary of what he's doing in his book, his whole book, all right? And then I give another signal phrase just to make it clear to my reader that I'm still talking about Torres. He suggests that friendships can be very difficult to keep up. Although intentions may be sincere, life can get in the way. One of the challenges may be communication. That is a summary, in my own words, of what Torres is doing in his book, The Compadre. All right. And then I reintroduce the author just to keep it clear for my reader that I'm referring to the author here. The author shows this when the character Joe, in a fit of rage, screams at his friend Sue. So the only direct quote in this whole paragraph is that piece in red right there. And then there's my documentation, Torres 4. I put Torres in the parenthetical reference there, or the in-text citation, same thing, because I had not mentioned Torres in that sentence even though I had mentioned him above. All right. In this scene, Torres, and there again, I'm repeating the fact that I'm still talking about Torres, just so it's totally clear for my reader. In this scene, Torres shows, and I'm explaining in this last piece, this is the bottom piece of the bread, how these ideas that I borrowed from Torres and summarized and then quoted directly relate to the main point of this paragraph. All right? Arguments turn into screaming matches, friendships can be damaged. So rather than screaming, friends should calmly explain their problems, which can perhaps preserve a friendship. All righty? So that's the sandwich model right there. All right, now, here's documentation. And I'm going to go through this part pretty fast. You guys have lots and lots of sources that you can look at that I've given you in this assignment where this video is going to be posted. And also just online by Googling. You guys, this is what I do when I forget how to format something according to MLA style guidelines. I just Google it, okay? How do I refer to multiple authors? Google, tell me, okay? How do I cite them? How do I format a works cited entry for this type of source? Google will tell you, you guys. All righty? So you have to document your sources. We've been talking about introducing them and integrating them. So this is part of the presentation where we talk about documenting them according to MLA style guidelines, which is a really, really important thing to do because failure to do that is plagiarism. Even if it's accidental, it's going to hurt you. So don't do it. And if you have any questions, you can always email me or like I said, ask Google. Okay, so I said earlier when I was talking about paraphrasing that one of the ways in which plagiarism is often committed by students is that they fail to put summaries and paraphrases completely into their own words and syntax, right? Or if they're mixing paraphrase and direct quote, they forget to put the borrowed language that's part of that combination into quotation marks. Okay, take another look at my Tanya Modilewski example where I'm combining paraphrase and direct quote. Modilewski's words are in quotation marks, okay? And the stuff that I'm not borrowing from her, but putting into my own words is not. And that's what you need to do to avoid plagiarism. All right, and this is from Hacker. Okay, direct quotes must be exactly word for word reproductions or else show where elements were left out with ellipses. All right, borrowed quotes are those ideas that other specific facts and visuals such as cartoons, graphs, and diagrams, any ideas you present in a summary or paraphrase that are not your own. All right, that's got to be documented. Oh, animation. Okay, so if we were together, I forgot I did that. Surprised me. But if we were together, I would ask you guys what you think common knowledge is. But since we're not, okay, common knowledge isn't just stuff like the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, all right? Or, in this hemisphere, or, the first president of the United States was George Washington. Those things are common knowledge, or the sky is blue. These are the responses I get most often when I ask students what they think of as common knowledge. But common knowledge is anything that can be found in any reference book, even if you don't already know it. Okay, so common knowledge would be something like Adam Lanza is the person who murdered, 20 people at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut, among them little children and their teachers. All right, I don't need to cite any source for that information because even if you didn't know it, it's common knowledge. All right, which brings me to the next definition. That which has been talked or written or reported about so often that virtually everybody knows it, and the original source is no longer known or is irrelevant. So you don't need to go track down if you want to cite, for example, what happened to Trayvon Martin. All right, that summary that I gave you of the basic facts in that case, I do not need to cite any source for those things. Okay, because they have entered into common knowledge. All right, and it would be really hard and really kind of useless to track down the very first, entity that reported on that thing that happened. It's not necessary, and and not useful to do that. Okay, but if you have any questions about what constitutes common knowledge and whether or not you need to cite it, you can email me and I'll help you with that. Okay, so we were talking about signal phrases, something I like to call introductory phrases, which leads into sourced material, whether that's summary, paraphrase, or direct quote, followed by a parenthetical citation or an in-text citation, as it's often referred to. All right. And then at the end of the paper is your list of works cited. So those things work together in MLA style. All right. The signal phrase, there are 3 elements of MLA documentation. The introductory or signal phrase where you name the source, the documentation at the end in parentheses, in-text citation or parenthetical citation, 2 different ways of referring to the same thing. And then the list of works cited at the end of your paper. Okay, and that's what it's called in MLA. It's called works cited, not bibliography, not sources. Okay, so your works cited page should be called that. It should be called works cited / consulted, as I said before. All right, and that provides full publication data for each source. Right, and the way that works for your reader is that they get some information about your source in your text, right, in the body of your paper. And then they could go down to the list of works cited, which is arranged alphabetically, to find out the rest of the publication information for that source. And then they can go track it down on their own. And that's how those things work together to streamline the necessary process of attribution and documentation. You've got to do it. You've got to give credit to the sources of the information that you're borrowing. That's called attribution. And then you've got to document it. Tell your reader where they can go find it on their own. All right, and failure to do that, as I said a couple times already, is plagiarism. You must do it. All right, I mentioned ellipses a moment ago. Those are the 3 spaced dots that indicate an omission in a direct quote. Ellipses and square brackets are for direct quotes only. Ellipses are for when you've added something, or excuse me, I'm flipping it. Ellipses are when you've omitted something from a direct quote, okay, in the middle of it. All right, so here's some examples. All right, we don't use ellipses leading into and out of direct quotes anymore, as this top example shows. We got rid of that. We don't do that anymore, okay? We use them at the beginning, or, excuse me, we use them in the middle, right, of direct quotes. So here's where the quote starts. Before the 18th century, writers and speakers typically referred to an indefinite subject, space, dot, space, dot, space, dot, space, with a they, their, or them. All right, end quote. And this is what was left out. This is what was where the ellipses are now. But that extra wasn't needed. We get it, right? So we could just leave that out and shorten the direct quote. All right, and that's what you're going for in the point that I made earlier about only using as much of the direct quote as you need to make your point. All right, and there's the parenthetical reference with only a page number of the original source in it and nobody's name because the author is already mentioned up here, Ben Yagoda. So there's no need to repeat that. Okay, I said that all of these documentation styles, right, have been designed to streamline this necessary process of attribution and documentation. And the idea is to get rid of the mess, okay? When I was a student, we used to have, and the internet was new, the World Wide Web was new, we used to have to put the whole URL of a web source into the parenthetical reference. And as you can imagine, that would be a big mess, okay, on the page. All right, so they're trying to clean it up while at the same time making it clear where the information is coming from. All right, you need to maintain the original meaning, preserve it. All right, and here's an example of square brackets being used when something needs to be added to a direct quote so that it's clear for the reader. If you're extracting something, a direct quote from its context and putting it into your writing, it might not be clear for the reader. There might be Verb tenses you need to change, as the blamed and blaming example shows, or information you need to add so that it's clear. I don't know if you guys know or familiar with my favorite movie of all time, The Big Lebowski. You guys really, The Big Lebowski is a perfect movie. I've seen that movie like 20 times, and I could watch it again right now. Okay, it's that good. The perfect film. All right, but anyway, that's my opinion. But this quote from that film would not be clear unless I added the part about the rug. If the quote just said, "It tied the room together," without any other context, you guys wouldn't know what the hell the dude was talking about. So I added the rug. All right. Okay, and here again is a little bit of review about parenthetical or in-text citations. Any of the information you put in parentheses is described as parenthetical, ever. That's why I like to use that phrase, parenthetical reference, because it makes sense to me. But some people call them in-text citations. You just need to know that that's the same thing. But it's the documentation given parentheses at the end of a sentence or a natural clause break about your source, whether it's the name of the source and a page number if one is available, or just the name of a source if no page number is available, or neither of those things if they're not available, or if you've already given them previously in your sentence in an introductory phrase or something. All right. So here's an example of Hacker 391. That's the author's name and the page number. All right. When the source that you have is paginated, okay, if it stays the same in print and PDF files, if there's no page or paragraph numbers, use well-developed signal phrases and no parenthetical citation, because you don't have any more information to give. All right, so look at the second example here, the Wikipedia article, solar flares. Okay, Wikipedia and solar flares is all the information that you have about the source, and it's already been given. So there's no need for a parenthetical reference, because there are no page numbers on Wikipedia articles. And I hope that makes sense. Okay, and I guess that's the end of that presentation.